Robert Crookston was my grandfather's, Jesse Crookston's grandfather. John Welch was the brother to Robert Crookston's wife, Ann Welch. I will tell you of their journey as recorded by Robert Crookston in his autobiography, in Robert's own words. At conference in October 1844, I was ordained a member of the 21st Quorum of 70s by President Joseph Young. When the Nauvoo temple was completed, I received my endowment, soon after which we began to prepare for our migration to the west. Brother Five started with many others to make the woodwork of our wagons. He made mine and a blacksmith for whom I had furnished coal. Having a chance to sell my lot, I managed to get a yoke of 8-year-old steers for the house and lot. This was all the team I had. There was a brother Don Nance by name who had a herd of cattle and horses who kindly lent me a yoke of cattle well broken. He had 8 wagons. I helped him to harness his teams, and Father rode on horseback and helped to drive the sheep. He had 2 daughters who drove mule teams. Brother Nance was a good, kind man, and all his family was good to us. We traveled over the country, which was mostly uninhabited, hardly any roads, and in many places we had to stop and cut bulrushes to put in the swampy holes so that our wagons could pass over. Yet there were no murmurings in the company, although we had nothing except what we had in our wagons and knew not where our next stopping place would be or what would it be like. We were cheerful and hopeful, for we knew that we had been led by men of God who were inspired of God. There were several camps made on the way that the people might stop and recruit. Luckily or unluckily for me, I was not in time to join the Mormon battalion, or I would in all probability have answered the call. There were very few who felt inclined to leave their loved ones and cross the desert to fight the battles of a country which had made outcasts of them. But everyone loyal to the priesthood marched away, and God was with them. And this fact constitutes one of the best arguments that we can produce to prove our loyalty to the government. When we arrived at the Missouri River, we drove the cattle in and they swam across, some of the outfits landing a mile below on the other side. There was a ferry boat to take our wagons across at a place called Cutler's Park, where there were several hundred wagons waiting to cross on it. It so happened that my wagon was next to John Welch's outfit. He was an Englishman who had a young, good-looking wife whom he called Eliza, his mother and his sister Anne. Anne was, to my notion, a very attractive lady, cheerful, refined in manner, a good companionable person with a sweet voice. Many a night she cheered the company with her singing of old songs, many of which were Scotch. In fact, I concluded there was no songs then written which she was unfamiliar. Now, at this point, I'd like to say that Robert does not mention that John and Eliza Welch had in their company a baby named Nicholas, born in 1846, and 2 foster children. Their names were Jane and John Miles, and were orphans whose parents were English converts and had died of fever in Nauvoo. Continuing Robert Crookston's story in his words. They were very fine neighbors, and soon we felt as if we had always known them. My father and mother soon grew very fond of Anne, and to say nothing of myself, and I determined to win her if I could. She seemed to have a natural gift for cheering and caring for the sick, and was always on hand to do so without money or prize. About this time we organized into a company to cut out and haul hay. Brother Vance was our captain. Some were to cut, some to rake, and some to haul, of which John Welch and I did a lot. Others did the stacking. By that time we had organized our camp near the river on a piece of land which was called winter quarters. Brother Welch and I built our cabins near each other and covered them with cottonwood bark, which made a good thatch. We then cut large trees, notched the bark in feet lengths, peeled it off in large flakes, and placed them on the roof. We then weighted them down with other logs to keep them from warping in the sun. While we were building our house, we camped out. Father and mother had their bed in a good sheltered place in a covered wagon. I am thankful that I did everything I knew how to make them as comfortable as possible. We used to sit around a campfire in the evenings. Father would play his violin and we sang hymns and songs. Father, I thought, was a good singer, and Anne would often be with us singing also. In fact, the Welch family and ours were quite neighborly. After the house was finished, the winter wood hauled, and and all, a man came up from Platte County, Missouri, wanting a company of men, all kinds of builders, to go with him to build a mill. He got about 20 men, so on the 20th day of November, 1846, I left mother and father and went with them to Missouri to work all winter. About a month after I left, father died very suddenly. It would be near Christmas time. Mother, naturally, was quite heartbroken alone in the world. The Welches, of course, came in to try and comfort her, and she persuaded Anne to stay with her, which she did a great deal of the time. There were many deaths in winter quarters that winter. All the lumber used had to be sawed with a whipsaw, and some of the people who died were buried without coffins. Mother was afraid that father would be, but thanks to Father Lot, who used to live on Joseph Smith's farm and was a good friend of ours, ordered a coffin and said that I would pay for it, and if not, he himself would. So father got a comparatively decent burial, and I paid the bill. Brother Welch was down in Missouri at the time of father's death and was a great comfort to my mother. She also helped to nurse some of the sick, of which there were a good many. My mother was among the number, and I had my cattle and wagon with me. They had been well wintered and were in good trim when I came home in early spring. I brought a load of provisions and pork up and broke up a lot of land and planted a good garden. The brethren broke up about 1,500 acres of prairie land and planted corn. In June, on the 20th day, 1847, Anne Welch and I were united in marriage. The ceremony was performed by Joseph Fielding in our neat new little cabin. A king in his palace was no happier than I was. I was sure I had got the smartest girl in the camp of Israel. Her words were like proverbs. She was well read and had a wonderful memory, one of the sweetest voices I had ever heard, and often entertained us with reciting the poems of Robert Burns and many others. She was a splendid housekeeper, always keeping within our means, and had quite a good understanding of the use of herbs, which came in handy very often. About 2 months after our marriage, I left my wife and mother, so my brother-in-law and I went to Savannah, Andrew County, Missouri to work. It was about 140 miles. John and I got working at digging a well. We struck water at 40 feet. The people were delighted. We got a good number of wells to dig for them, and they were always ready to pay us when our work was done. Although it was the state that had driven the people out, yet it was far north of the county where they lived and died, and there seemed to be no mob spirit there. It had been predicted by the leaders that those who needed an outfit to go on to the valleys of the mountains and went down to Missouri to make one would find employment and be blessed. But if they stayed after they had sufficient means to come on, the Lord would cease to bless them, and they would grow poor, lose the good spirit, and be unable to follow the church. This I have seen bitterly fulfilled. There were brethren there who was much better off than we. They thought they would just stay one more year. The last I heard of them, they had not migrated. The counsel we had received was for us not to come without 18 months' provisions, so that a good-sized family had to have 2 wagons. So we had to stay until the crops were harvested. We stayed in Savannah until late in the fall and then went home. While I was away, Anne, my wife, had been taking care of mother, who was getting old, but who was pretty well. She also had been helping care for the sick in camp. One of those whom she had visited frequently was a lady, Mrs. Holland by name, who had lost her husband. She had lost 2 or 3 sons, boys rather, and a little girl, Carolyn by name. It seemed that Mrs. Holland had been influenced to remarry with the promise of getting herself and children taken to the valleys of the mountains. She had not been as comfortable in this marriage as she had expected in more ways than one. She was very sick and very unhappy in the thought that perhaps she was not going to get well, and did not like the prospect of leaving Carrie and the family into which she had married. She therefore asked Anne one day if she would take care of Carrie in case she died. Anne did not know what to do to what she said. She told her that she would be willing, but that her husband was away and she could not do so without first consulting him. As it happened, I came home about that time. We talked the matter over and decided to take the little girl with us in case her mother did not recover. The poor soul passed away in a few days, and after the funeral we both attended, we took her by the hand home with us, and she seemed glad to go. Carrie was a good little girl, and we tried to do the best we could for her. We were all fond of her. Mother took her in her bed and was kind to her.